The important thing you have to realize is you look at the general culture and you say, how much trust or agreement is there? If you look at the United States or the UK now, you'll see there is a lot less trust and agreement than there was when we were children. That is why the government is always a manifestation of that. That is what we're measuring on this. For example, in Nazi Germany, I'm afraid to say with thought, with good reason. They didn't trust that they could tell their next door neighbor that they thought Hitler was crazy. He might report him and they take the guy away. See, there's no trust.
We're going to dive into the scale of government. It seems very appropriate today.
Yes, this scale has been appropriate for at least 4,000 years.
It's a valuable lens through which to view and navigate what is a complex political landscape, especially of the 21st century. Hopefully, we can learn from the successes and failures of the past. We can craft governance systems that promote freedom, equity, stability, and adaptability in a rapidly changing world.
I think you're overly optimistic. The ability to read has been steadily going down in the civilized world for many years now. Getting people to learn anything is a major challenge. I've been involved in education continuously from the age of 3, so I've watched this deterioration. I noticed specifically circa 1990, I was self-employed, so I always had people coming in to apply to work for me. And I noticed that circa 1990, there was a dramatic deterioration in the ability of people to simply read and write. You know, to have people fill out an employment form, they couldn't, it was like a 10-year-old. And it's continued like that. So those people won't be too interested in this book because they don't read books anyway. So you made a comment a few minutes ago about the complexity of all of this. The reason it's complex is because they don't understand this scale. Once you know the scale, the complexity goes away and everything becomes quite simple. Now, I'll give you an example. You hear all the time about the left and the right. It's completely made up. It's arbitrary. And I can make a complete fool out of anybody who brings that up within 3 minutes. You see, it doesn't work because it's not left or right, it's up or down. They have it in the wrong axis. It's up or down. There are 7 basic types of government. And regardless of the mechanism, as I explained in the chapter, it's at a certain level. In other words, every government on earth is at one of these levels. As I point out in the chapter, I'm not aware of any earth governments, I'm talking about countries now as opposed to states or counties, that are above level 4. They're all 4, 5, 6, or 7. That is why the world looks the way it does. This is a spiral scale. There is an apparent congruence between levels 1 and 7. If you listen to libertarians or anarchists, they're very confused. They have these 2 subjects mixed up. The reason they have them mixed up is it's an overlap. It's a spiral. There are people who think they're anarchists who are actually libertarians, and people who are libertarians who are actually anarchists. And people looking from the sidelines can't separate that either because they don't know this scale. This is a gradual scale. And this is an important factor because most of these governments exist in between the levels. In other words, you will have level 4 government that's transitioning into being a level 5 government. So you're going to find some level 5 traits and some level 4 traits. That is extremely common. In fact, it's the rule rather than the exception. Because when you're talking about millions of people, it's a generality to talk about the level. The AI is taking over and we will be slaves to it in a generation. So after that happy prediction, I'll go back to the fact that this is something I go into in the chapter and I explain how this works. In fact, there's one paragraph in this chapter which I explain the entire history of the United States, how it deteriorated from a level 1 government down to a level 5 government, which it now is. I give dates and specifics in one paragraph. To me, it's patently obvious. Once you know the scale and ignore the confused and hyperbolical rhetoric, this is very clear. This is a general scale, meaning you find a level for a certain government or country, or it could even be a state or a city. You find that level, that's it, you're done. Now, of course, you can try to move up to the next level, lots of luck on that, because it's a big deal. It's general in that once you find it, you're done. And that's true of all the general scales, although you can try to improve it. Then, of course, you can go to another area. You can say, what level is Russia at? What level is Ukraine at, et cetera, finest level for that country. And then you're done with that country.
When I was reading through the chapter, looking at the scale, I was thinking about what I described the current state of government in the UK and the US. I wondered whether these governments are closer to libertarianism, democracy, socialism, fascism, or another level of the scale. I thought to myself, the UK especially are likely somewhere between levels 3 and 4 or 4 and 5, democracy and socialism. In the US, there's an ever-increasing advent of socialism and communism. What specific characteristics of these governments would lead me to place them at a particular level? Are there particular policies or actions or societal conditions that suggest their placement?
Okay, so first let me answer with specificity about the countries you referenced. The UK is at level 4, transitioning into level 5. That's why they're shutting down free speech. That is a level 5 trait. So it's 4 transitioning into 5. The United States has already transitioned into 5. The United States is a fascist government. There are powerful communist groups here who are trying to transition into communism, which is the next level down. And of course, the people opposing them are trying to get it back up to level 4, whether they realize it or not. For example, I lived in California off and on 30 years. It was crystal clear to me it was a fascist state. Now it is transitioning into communism. There's no happy news here. Let me explain why. First of all, I need to talk about the axis, because the most important question in any of these scales is, what are we measuring with this scale? If you have a scale, it could be a yardstick or a meter stick, right? If it's a meter stick, it's measuring centimeters. If it's a yardstick, it's measuring inches. So you need to know, what are we measuring? And that is the dotted vertical line on the right. Now, the top of the scale, actually above level 1, because absolutes are unattainable, is complete trust and agreement. You will never have complete trust and agreement. But if you had much trust and agreement, that would be level 1. Below level 6 is no trust or agreement. You're never going to get to no trust or agreement. For example, when you go out on the road and drive your car, there is some agreement that you're going to stay on your side of the road and the guy coming the other way is going to stay on his side of the road. And you generally trust that's going to happen. If you didn't, you wouldn't take your car out. You would say, how do I know this guy's not going to come across and smash into me? Cumulative velocity of 120 miles per hour if you're doing 60. And the reason for that is that question is settled by a certain trust or agreement. So there are always degrees of trust or agreement. For example, if you look at the Nazis, we're at level 5. Now, there was some trust and some agreement, but not a lot. So if you look carefully within the Third Reich, you'll see there was some agreement, there was some trust. Millions and millions of German people thought he was the greatest guy in the world. And not only in Germany, in Austria too, and the whole German-speaking world thought he was the greatest. And certainly the Nazis, he was the greatest. I think he's on the short list for the worst person in human history.
Can I just pick up on a point here about the Nazi regime? When I'm looking into it, it seemed to me there were two things, the beneficial aspects of it and the catastrophic aspects of it. The beneficial aspects of the Nazi regime, and I'll probably get shouted down for this, but initially they brought economic recovery and restored a sense of national pride after the humiliations of World War I. There were advances in infrastructure, military power, and industrial capacity, but the catastrophic outcomes included the Holocaust, the devastation of World War II, loss of millions of lives, destruction of Europe, and the moral and ethical degradation of German society. Their totalitarian regime led to immense suffering and left a dark legacy that continues to influence global politics and ethics.
From my extensive studies, what I concluded is that the Germans lost World War II. The Nazis did not. The Nazis survived. A lot of them went to Antarctica. A lot of them went to South America. Werner von Braun was an SS officer, and all of his something like 100 engineers and scientists were all brought over to the United States under Operation Paperclip. He and his assistants created the American space program. That was the beginning of the American space program. So the Americans were very smart to import all of that scientific and engineering skill, but at the same time, they were bringing Nazis into the country. But there were Nazis in the country even before they brought over those scientists on Operation Paperclip. That's what it was called. Let me finish talking about the Axis, okay? The amount of trust and agreement in society, the de facto amount of trust and agreement in the society cumulatively determines the level. Has nothing to do with whether or not there are elections or monarch, has nothing to do with that. It's how much trust and agreement is there. If you look at the United States, for example, in the Old West, you had all these small towns popping up, communities with ranches and farms around them. There was a lot of trust and agreement, tremendous amount of trust and agreement in those communities. They were generally at level 3. It was a legitimate democracy. So in order to have a legitimate democracy, you have to have a lot of trust and agreement. So the United States started, if you remember the Depression, that was catastrophic for most Americans. There are always people who make money from these things, but generally we had 25% unemployment. It was a catastrophe, and that really allowed organized crime to take root. Organized crime, in case you're wondering, is a fascist organization. They operate according to fascist principles. No meaningful difference between Mussolini and Al Capone. You're looking at the same thing. Okay, so the United States, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected, started transitioning into socialism because trust and agreement had dropped to a point where you couldn't really have a democracy. The Supreme Court stopped him many times when he tried to do various things that were unconstitutional. When you become a Supreme Court judge, you're there for life. So we have guys who are 60, 70 years old, and in their minds are still in a republic, see? So they prevented him from doing many things. Nevertheless, that was the beginning of socialism in America, and that came to fruition when Jack Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963. Then you saw the United States become a fully socialist country under his successor, Lyndon Baines Johnson. The United States has been a socialist country since 1964 and started the transition into fascism when the Twin Towers went down on 9/11. That was an inside job. It was intentional. Actually, there were no airplanes. Those were holograms. I actually have seen the brochures of the aerospace company where they advertise the holograms. There are United States military aircraft that can send out a hologram and another airplane will see this other plane and they think they have two planes to fight. So while they're busy firing with the hologram, the United States plane can take them down. That's exactly what was done. It was a controlled explosion. That was to the globalist fascists who had already controlled the country since 1963. That's how they converted it into fascism. That was the beginning of fascist America. Many states had already become fascist. As I said, I lived in California. I could tell you stories in California that would turn your hair gray very quickly. It was a fascist state. I got the hell out of there while I could. The important thing you have to realize is you look at the general culture and you say, how much trust or agreement is there? If you look at the United States or the UK now, you'll see there is a lot less trust and agreement than there was when we were children. That is why the government is always a manifestation of that. That is what we're measuring on this. For example, in Nazi Germany, they're afraid to say with thought, with good reason. They didn't trust that they could tell their next door neighbor that they thought Hitler was crazy. He might report him and they take the guy away. See, there's no trust. So, for example, I've actually had official government personnel commit unlawful acts against me because they found out my political affiliation. So now I'm extremely quiet about that. Sometimes I get offered bumper stickers. No thanks. I'm not putting a bumper sticker on. I'm not crazy. In case you haven't noticed, a month ago, they tried to murder Trump. Didn't surprise me. I've been predicting that for a year. I thought if they can't put him in prison, they'll kill him. There was another guy they found who was plotting to kill him, who's been arrested because he was going to kill him when he came to Arizona, an Arizona guy. So the dividing line, the horizontal dividing line, is very important here. Now, as with many of the scales, there is this horizontal dividing line which separates the sane from the insane. Now, in many of them, the dividing line is at level 4. In this case, it's not. In this case, the dividing line is between 3 and 4. So socialism is insane, but it's not as insane as fascism. And fascism is insane, but it's not as insane as communism. And communism is insane, but not as insane as anarchy. So the sanest people would be the ones who would have a libertarian system. Because they're very sane, you can trust them and you can agree with them. We're all going to agree we shouldn't murder people. See, that's an agreement. And so they won't. That's why I don't think there's even any hope that a national libertarian government will exist in our lifetimes. As far as I know, they're all level 4 or lower at this point. Now, if you know of an exception, please tell me. I'd like to look into it. But there are no real democracies. There is certainly no real republics, and libertarianism is just pie in the sky at this point. So for the United States to go from where it is now, which is level 5, back to level 4, would be an improvement. The top 3 levels are populated by people. The bottom 4 levels are populated by insane people. So the sane and the insane is important. Observe the behavior of people at level 1, 2, and 3. They are sane people. They behave sanely. Generally speaking, of course, there's always going to be a few crazy people, but in the United States, between 1830 and 1930, we had democracy, and it was a pretty sane country. You didn't have 90% of what goes on with our government today. It was constitutional. In the last 100 years, the Constitution has been ignored, subverted, undermined, avoided more and more, which is why they've been able to bring it down to these lower levels. If the Constitution, which is a level 2 document, were applied, all these things wouldn't be possible. For example, the CIA going around murdering people. Now, for example, Tulsi Gabbard, who was a Democrat representative for 8 years, is now on the terrorist watch list, and she's being shadowed 24 hours a day. That's just crazy. She's, I think, a major in the military. It's not sane. So, of course, most of what's going on in the United States now is just crazy. The further it goes down, the crazier it's going to get. That's why you have, for all practical purposes, a civil war going on in the United States. Now, I was aware that civil war began in the year 2000 and has just been getting worse ever since. More and more people are separating themselves from the mainstream and objecting to it, which is why they voted for Trump, because he's not even a politician. There's a lot of that going on now, where you have people like Kerry Lake, who was prevented from becoming governor of Arizona by election fraud. She's never been a politician. She was a media person, but she's behind the same trend to try to get the country back to level 4. So you have to realize that when you're talking to people at different levels, you're going to see different levels of insanity. Don't be surprised when you see people behaving in an insane manner. It tells you who they are. You have millions and millions of Americans who are so insane, they really shouldn't be allowed to vote, but they vote nevertheless. That's why the country is collapsing. There's no quick remedy to this. When you're talking about changing a level for a country, especially a big one like the United States, which has now something like 350 million people in it, it's a big mess. It takes a long time to turn the ship around. Or if you like another analogy, stopping a train, it takes many miles to stop a train. This is not something that happens overnight. As I said, the federal government was overthrown on November 22nd, 1963, when they killed the president and installed LBJ, who actually was behind the assassination. There's a whole book that details that, if you want to find out about that. If you look at it by the scale, all of this stuff is not difficult to understand. I can look at a person, see how he behaves. Doesn't matter what he says, because as I point out, anybody can say anything. You have some tinfoil hat come to you and say, yeah, the Martians have me under surveillance. Well, that's not true. It's not true because he's nuts. It's the same thing with government people. They just say absolutely crazy things. Trump was president for 4 years. We saw what he did, and yet they still continue to say crazy things, none of which appeared in his first term of office. None of it. He's a dictator. He's going to stop all elections. He's going to take us off the air. Just crazy stuff. These are people who are at these lower levels. Now, I should mention anarchy. Anarchy, well, it has to be on this scale because it connects to level 1, but it's really a lack of government. The word anarchy literally means no government. It's a level where there's not even an attempt to have a government. That's the only thing that's worse than communism.
Let's look at anarchy. It's the absence of government. So trust and agreement have entirely broken down, leading to chaos. There's no one in charge, and order is impossible to maintain. Can anarchy ever be a desirable state, or is it always a precursor to the rise of some form of government, such as communism or fascism?
If you go up from anarchy, you go up to communism. The basic axiom of Septemics is that you can only move to an adjacent level. You can either go up or down to an adjacent level, unless you're at level 1. If you're at level 1, there's no place above to go. You can only go down. If you're at level 7, you can't go down. You can only go up. But those extremes tend to be rare in most cases. So you're always looking at what's up and what's down. So I look at these efforts to put democracy into places where there's never been democracy. It's just laughable. It's not going to happen. Now, it might do some good in some cases. It might even result in an improvement in the sense of you might be able to get a fascist country up to being a socialist country. But you can't make a fascist country into a democracy. Can't be done because this scale exists in nature. And like all the other scales, it's natural phenomena. I just observed it and wrote it down. So if people get the scale and understand it, it's very easy to figure out what's going on, who's doing what. And you can ignore a lot of the noise and the rhetoric and understand who's doing what. So the fact that this scale is not known and is probably not going to be widely known for a very long time guarantees a future of chaos, destruction, and suffering. So that's what you should expect. That's what's been going on for 6,000 years, and it will continue. The main departure from what's been going on for 6,000 years was the United States founding in 1776. The Articles of Confederation, which was the original bond between the 13 colonies, was a libertarian government. They had no power to even tax. Everything was voluntary. The founding fathers, who were very smart men, saw this is not working, and they set up a Republican government. The famous quote that most people have heard when Benjamin Franklin, the revered statesman, came out from the hall where they had just voted on the Constitution, and the woman said, "Dr. Franklin, what kind of a government is it going to be?" And he said, "A republic if you can keep it." So the founding fathers had grave reservations about how long this could last, knowing human nature, to the extent that the Constitution is adhered to, it brings some sanity and some order into the craziness that has become American life. You have states or the federal government try to do things that are unconstitutional, and the Supreme Court says, no, you can't do that. It's not constitutional. Now, of course, because most people in the federal government and even in most state governments, although it varies, are at level 4 or lower, they're sneaky. They have crazy ideas. They're not truthful about them. And so really the United States is controlled covertly. Who are the most covert people? The CIA, the FBI. I mean, they are continuously covert. That's their nature. So that's where the power really is now. And people are coming to realize that's why it's the same people who killed Jack Kennedy tried to kill Trump. It's the same faction. It's the globalist fascists who are behind the scene. Now, in 1963, Americans were a lot less cynical than they are today because the government was at a higher level. It was a socialist government, which is antipathetic, but antipathetic is nowhere near as bad as brutal, which is fascism.
I was thinking about socialism, which we're moving into fascism, or we're at that level at the moment, in terms that socialism is depicted as a system where the government exerts more control with less trust in individuals. So in their ability to manage their own lives, you have the welfare state. It's the shift from individual freedom to collective responsibility, which has led to a welfare state. Is the transition from democracy to socialism inevitable if trust in individual judgment declines?
Yes, that's the whole point. That people in the government don't trust the citizens. And this has been said for a long time by people like Ronald Reagan. Who can be trusted with your money? You or some faceless, nameless bureaucrat in another state? It's a pretty obvious answer. Since they don't trust the people, they have to control them. The type of control goes from antipathetic control of socialism to brutal control of fascism to covert control of communism. Communism is very covert. After that, it just falls apart into anarchy. So basically, if you study the history of Earth, which I have done, this is a fascist planet. Most of the governments throughout the world, throughout 6,000 years, have been fascist governments. The king of Slobovia runs the show, and if somebody says something he doesn't like, he has them killed. That's what fascists do. So, in a sense, if you study history, and Thomas Jefferson said this, there's always a tendency to return to fascism. But then you get people who are so crazy, fascism is not enough. They want communism, which is even lower. But you see, when people try to parse this in terms of left and right, it's just a mess. I am very much an aficionado or an enthusiast of Thomas Paine, who was really the father of the American Revolution. He was considered a liberal, maybe even a radical in his day. So does that make me a liberal? It depends on who you ask. Now, I've studied Thomas Jefferson. He was definitely considered a liberal. But if you look at many of the laws he propounded and the things he said, by today's standards, he's a conservative. So in other words, what is our standard? So left and right and liberal and conservative really are counterproductive. What's clear in the United States that's become a movement now is that it's not left or right. It's the people against the government. You have the government that killed Jack Kennedy, who brought down the Twin Towers, who had the phony justification for the Vietnam War. This is the same globalist fascists. They have just been gaining more and more power, pushing the country to where they want it to be, which is fascist. Now they have succeeded. We have a fascist government. The federal government blatantly violates the law on a daily basis. They don't even care if the people see it anymore, because if they don't like you, they'll just kill you. Don't think that the person who kills you is going to be charged for that. The mafia became connected and ally of the federal government in 1940, okay? And so you have the mafia was mixed up in the killing of Jack Kennedy. The CIA engineered it. They used mafia people, which they do all the time. Many people in the mafia on their deathbed say that, for example, there's a famous mafioso who got out, managed to get out. They didn't kill him, did go to prison, but now he's out, and he goes around trying to convince young men to not have a life of crime. That's his whole life now, telling them it's a bad thing, you shouldn't do it, I was in it, here's why it doesn't work. And he says, whenever we dealt with the government, it was always the Democrats. So in those days, you had Thomas E. Dewey, the governor of New York. He didn't want to have anything to do with the mafia. He was against the mafia. So he was a Republican. The Democrats have been tied in very closely with the mafia for a long time now, for generations. For example, if you study the Clintons, you'll find that there are over 100 people who died under mysterious circumstances who were connected with the Clintons. Somebody who supposedly committed suicide by shooting himself in the back of the head twice, which is obviously impossible. Most people in America realize that the government is not under their control, although it's supposed to be based on the Constitution. So if you try to do something like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. tried to run for president, the Democrats got rid of him. They repeatedly sued him, and they did not allow him to debate. They did not want him. And if you listen to him, he's not an evil person or a bad person or a phony person. He's basically very much in the same line of thought as his father and his uncle. They got rid of his uncle and his father, didn't they? So there's a whole new burgeoning Democratic Party in power. Even if they lose an election, they're still in power, because that's who the globalist fascists are utilizing. Now, it doesn't mean that they don't control some of the Republicans too, because they do. Basically, the federal government is controlled by bribes and extortion. So everything is done by, we'll give you $1 million for your campaign if you vote for this bill. Or in the alternative, if you don't vote for this bill, we have photographs of you with a boy that we will release. So what they do is they have a whole major operation of putting people in situations where they can be controlled by extortion. So that's how the United States is run now. And I suspect a lot of that is going on in UK now.
Yeah.
It's not a pretty picture, but I urge everybody to study this and realize that I've gotten to the bottom of all of this. It's about trust and agreement. And no matter what labels you put on it, you're at that level. For example, the UK has a monarchy. It's a socialist government which is propounding moving toward fascism. And the fact that there's a king or a queen is irrelevant. People focus on mechanisms of government. And it doesn't matter because they have elections in Cuba. The communist gets 95% of the vote and they move on to the next election. By no stretch of the imagination is it a legitimate democracy, as the US used to be. This is a global war and it will continue far into the future. If Donald Trump had not spearheaded this movement 8 years ago, there wouldn't be this uprising of the people because it's too easy for the government to squash people. It's hard for them to squash Trump because he's a billionaire and he has universal name recognition. He had that before he ever ran for government. Prior to him running for president, he was a very popular person, very well thought of, treated very well in the press. By no stretch of the imagination, a crazy person, very rational. He was interviewed many years ago by Oprah Winfrey, and she said, "Are you going to run for president?" He said, "No, but I may have to. But I'll tell you this, if I run, I'll win." Think about that. Everybody said he had no chance against Hillary Clinton, but he still won. And he predicted that years in advance. This is an unusual person. Somebody tries to blow his brains out, and he stands up and puts his fist in the air and says, "Fight." Just happened a month ago. Whatever flaws he may have, he has become the leader of this movement to give the government back to the people. We don't care if you're a liberal or a conservative. You're an American. And if you're an American, you should be in control of the government. They lost control of the government when they murdered JFK. And it's been getting worse ever since because they're still concealing what happened 60 years later. Now, there are people like me who are studious, who go out of their way to find out about these things, who know what happened, but it's not something that's known to the general populace. A lot of people still think Kennedy was killed by Oswald. That's like believing in Santa Claus. That's what they know. So it gets back to the question of education. How much do people know? Do they read? The government knows this, and television and all the other media are there for two purposes. One is to distract you. Let's keep you watching the football game, whether it's American football or English football, the boxing match, the baseball game, or all these stupid TV shows. We want to keep you distracted so you can't pay attention to the fact that the CIA has taken over the government. And the other half of it is propaganda. They just lie. They just straight out lie. Anybody who actually believes the report of the Warren Commission is an idiot. The things that they propounded can't possibly be true. Furthermore, they have had people try to make the shots. Top marksmen try to make the shots that they claim Oswald made. Nobody could do it. He was a patsy, as he said. So the CIA is very smart. When they set up a crime, they have a patsy, and that's who gets blamed for it. Takes the heat off them. That's standard operating procedure. Mafia does the same thing. So that's government on earth. Do I object to socialism? Not as much as I object to fascism. Do I object to fascism? Not as much as I object to communism. Any questions?
I feel there's a brutal repression, and it's not even covert, but there's this purging and censorship and forced collectivization and widespread human abuses. I think people are now being imprisoned, and the state's control is stifling individual freedoms and creativity and economic efficiency. That's only going to lead to a legacy of trauma, economic hardship, and anarchy eventually, because you've probably seen on the streets in the UK,
Yes.
people are rioting north and
Right.
south, east and west of the, and now there's a huge petition on change.org to get the prime minister out of office because of his socialist fascist policies of
Right.
jailing somebody for making a comment about the government and Elon Musk taking the EU to task. Who the hell are the EU to interfere with American citizens?
I'll tell you who, they're globalist fascists. They are trying to bring all of Earth under a single totalitarian rule. And so far, they've been succeeding. That takes a long time. It takes a long time to turn the ship. But now you have Robert F. Kennedy, a liberal Democrat, who is now allied with Trump, who's Republican. Okay, so what does that tell you? Tulsi Gabbard, who was a Democrat representative from one of the most liberal states in the Union, left the Democrat Party and is a supporter of Trump. So what this tells you is it's not about left and right. It's not about Democrat or Republican. It's not about liberal or Tory. It's about the people against the rulers. And this is a global struggle. So what Hitler tried to do, he basically wanted to take over all of Europe. That's the same thing that's going on in the United States now. What the Soviets tried to do, right? They wanted the whole world to be communist. It's the same thing, but it's not really separated into countries now. The globalist fascists are very much allied with the Chinese communists because the communists are using the same repressive control that the globalists would want. And by the way, the Chinese communists are not really communists anymore because they have free enterprise now. So they have moved up to level 5. It's just that nobody realizes that because they don't know this stuff. And do with the Soviet Union. It was at level 6 and has now moved up to level 5. And the reason for that is communism is so grotesquely unworkable. It doesn't last long. Look at Cuba. It's just a mess. We basically have a fascist world. That is what the globalist fascist wants. That's why I call them globalist fascists, because they're globalists and they're fascists. And that's what they want. There are at most 8,000 people on Earth who control almost everything. They control the wealth, they control the media, they control the universities, they control the churches, they control the governments. It's a tiny group of people. It's much less than 1%. It's actually 1 out of a million, statistically, who control everything. The Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, and then you have the Kennedys. Most of the Kennedy family is still supporting the Democrats. RFK is having trouble with his family because he said, I cannot stand what this is doing. So this is why you're seeing otherwise sane Democrats like Kirsten Sinema, my senator here in Arizona. She declared herself an independent. She just couldn't stomach it anymore. She's not a bad person. She's a socialist, but she's not a fascist.
I was thinking about the media. They play a crucial role in shaping public perception, which often exacerbates division and distrust. Right. In both the UK and the US, the media's portrayal of government actions are either as overreach or necessary control that pushes public opinion and influences the government's actual perceived position, I would see on this scale, because if the media fosters distrust and fear, that could hasten a descent towards level 6, level 7. I was wondering, how do you think public perception and media portrayal of these governments influence their placement on the scale? Could the media's role be contributing to a shift either up or down the scale?
Of course it does. The mainstream media in the United States is in the pocket of the globalist fascists. They do what they're told. So they just go on the air and lie. Trump is a racist. Now, I'm from New York. I knew about Donald Trump when I was 15. He was in the paper every day. He was probably the most prominent non-political person in New York for a generation. And I know for a fact he's not a racist. He has Black friends, Mexican friends, Islamic friends, Jewish friends. The only color he cares about is green, the color of money. It's just a lie. It's just an outright lie. And they've been doing this for years and years. If they want to get rid of you, they call you a fascist. It doesn't matter if there are any facts to support it, because people who cannot think critically will just accept it. Oh, yeah, Trump is a racist. I happen to know for a fact he's not. Now, I'm not telling you who to vote for, and I'm not supporting any political parties. I'm just saying that is an outright lie. And it's one of many. These are professional liars. They go on the air every day and they lie and lie. And part of their lying is spin. They put a spin on it, the word they choose.
I also know there are voices in my small circle who are advocating for minimal government and more individual freedoms. But these are increasingly overshadowed by the realities of the modern state, where control, intervention, and overreach are seen as necessary in their eyes. But the complexity of today's social and economic challenges makes a return after this discussion. I'm seeing that the return to level 1 or 2 seems unlikely in the near future, as you alluded to. What, in your view, would be the implications for, I'd say, both the UK and the US if they continue on their current paths? Are there any historical precedents on the scale that might predict the outcomes of this current trajectory?
That's why I mentioned the Third Reich. I mentioned the Soviet Union. China is very much the same thing: authoritarian, totalitarian, oppressive governments. You look at the things that these people did, they're just horrific. In the United States, you hear about Hitler slaughtering the Jews. But I think more people were slaughtered by the Soviet Union because it's a lot bigger. And when there was a famine, when Mao Zedong was around, there was a famine, and they said, oh, China can afford to lose 1 million people. That was the attitude about the famine. Now, someone who is sane would have said, load up the trucks and send them rice today. So it's not a happy picture. As far as you mentioned level 1 and level 2, forget about level 1 and level 2. They only exist in a book, okay? They're not going to happen in your lifetime. The whole point of Septemics is that you can predict what's going to happen. You see the level that it's at. The United States is morphing into fascism. The fascists started to take over when they killed Kennedy. They completed their takeover when they took down the Twin Towers. And now we have a fascist country. They just do outright illegal things. They don't care. That's what you get in fascist countries.
What do you think, Jim, could be done to reverse these negative trends and potentially move either country back up the scale towards greater liberty and democracy?
In the UK, you have Nigel Farage with the Reform Party. He is on the same wavelength with Donald Trump. And in America, you have this movement now where you're having people, all kinds of people, Democrats and liberals, all joining in this movement. The most earth-shaking one recently is RFK endorsing Trump. Who would have thought of that? I'm not a partisan person. I'm not a political person. I know this scale like the back of my hand because it's thrust upon me every time I turn on the news. Once you know the scale, it's not surprising. You see these media people say, oh, I'm shocked at what's going on. I'm not shocked. I predicted that they would try to kill Trump a year ago, and they'll probably try again. That's what you get from a level 5 government. They don't even mess with the top half of the scale. It doesn't exist. It's a pipe dream, and that's why people can't understand what's going on. Septemics is about seeing what's in front of your face and identifying it. You look at it, you say, this is an apple. It's not a pear, it's not an orange, and it's not a grapefruit. It is an apple. That is what science is about. And then engineers like myself take these facts and create devices that are useful to people. And that's what Septemics is. It's a conceptual tool for you to understand what's going on.
If we can craft governance and systems that promote freedom, equity, stability, and adaptability, maybe that is a pipe dream, but I still hold on to freedom. It's a huge task, and it's one that I'm going to stay on track with. Could you recommend any of these books? I'm so interested in this subject that tells the story.
For example, the book written by Albert Speer, Inside the Third Reich. Albert Speer was not an evil person, and he was not a stupid person, but he did what people normally do. He did the same thing that Werner von Braun did. He worked within the system he was in. A German living in 1930, 1940, they both became SS officers, so they would have clout. So Werner von Braun was interested in rocketry, okay? So these were not bad people, although they allied themselves with a bad group in order to go forward. If Speer and von Braun had not become Nazis, we would not be talking about them today. They would have been pushed aside. We would not know who they were. They would have accomplished nothing. So you always have to work within the system that you're in, or else you just get squashed. And if you work within the system, you can get something done. Albert Speer risked his life to stop Hitler's scorched earth policy, which would have been catastrophic for the German people. And he actually said to Hitler, what about after the war? If there are no schools and there are no railroads and there are no hospitals, how are they going to survive? See, but he was talking to a crazy person. But Hitler liked him so much. He was like Hitler's son, that he didn't have him killed, which is really good karma for Albert Speer. He's the only person at the Nuremberg trials who apologized and recanted. And because of that, they did not give him the death penalty. They sent him to prison, during which he wrote the book I just cited.
Come so far from Athens, which was celebrated for its contributions to philosophy, arts, and the concept of democracy itself, but it also had significant limitations because it excluded women, slaves, and non-citizens from political participation. That system was also prone to mob rule and populism, and that led to very poor decision-making, such as during the Peloponnesian War, which contributed to Athens' eventual decline.
If you're asking for books, I recommend what Plato wrote, Plato's Republic. He was dead set against democracy.
Yeah.
Here you are.
I'm reading that. It allows for broad participation and cultural growth, but it can be really unstable. And as I said earlier, it can be prone to very poor and ineffective decision-making.
If you have people who you can trust, and who you can agree with, then you can have a democracy. That's what the United States had for 100 years. Between Andrew Jackson and FDR, you had democracy for 100 years. And that is the period in which the United States became a great nation. So there's two books to read. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Jim. This is a valuable lens through which to view and navigate this political landscape in the 21st century. Jim, thank you once again, and I'll see you next week.
Thank you, Peter.